The next class of submarines started by the Japanese was the 2,554 surfaced and 3,561 submerged ton I-16 class, also known as the Hei-Gata C1 type, or just the C1 type. And we again have a new heavyweight champion. You get the idea. These were the last class of Japanese submarine completed before the war. They were based on the I-7 class. They added 2 more forward torpedo tubes, bringing the count up to 8. Their particular function was to operate as midget submarine motherships, which was how they made a name for themselves. Each could originally carry a single midget sub behind the sail. There was no umbilical, so the midget could not be boarded while the submarine was submerged. The boat had to surface to launch and recover the midget. Not that recovering happens much, as the midgets usually didn't survive their mission. They were technically not suicide operations, but in practice, well, let's just say I hope the crew made their peace before they left. The idea of the midget was understandable. Small boats that could infiltrate shallow enemy ports, wreak havoc, and get away. Throughout the war, Japanese midget subs came in several varieties, each with many one-offs but a few main types. The Type A, or Hei-Gata, was a 2-man boat that could reach 19 knots with a range of 100 nautical miles at 2 knots and carried 2 450mm torpedoes in the nose. They had no engine to recharge their batteries, so once they died, they died. The Type B, or Otsugata, added a tank engine to recharge the batteries, which tripled their range. The Type C, or Hei-Gata, added a third crew member and a better engine, extending their range on the surface to 500 nautical miles at 6 knots. The Type D, or Hei-Gata, or Koryu, raised the crew to 5 and added a more powerful engine, which let them do 1,000 nautical miles at 8 knots on the surface. They came late to the war, only entering service in 1944. The Kairyu was smaller even than the Type A's and went back down to 2 crew. They were defensive in nature and meant to repel an amphibious invasion force. They entered service even later than the Type D's, and all were converted into suicide craft held in reserve to defend Japan. Fortunately, none saw action. The Kaiten weren't technically midget subs, so we're going to table them for later. Again, none of the I-6 survived the war. Again, being large, they were easy to detect, slow to dive, easy to track underwater, and hard to maneuver. A second batch, the I-46s, or Hei-Gata C1 type, are sometimes grouped in with them, but I'm going to do them separately. I-16 was started September 15, 1937, and completed March 30, 1940. I-18 was started August 25, 1937, and completed January 31, 1941. I-20 was started November 16, 1937, and completed September 26, 1940. I-22 was started November 25, 1937, and completed March 10, 1941. I-24 was started December 5, 1938, and completed October 31, 1941. Main armament was 8 bow 533mm tubes for 20 torpedoes. A single open 140mm deck gun was mounted forward of the sail. Propulsion on the surface was provided by 2 diesel engines which produced 12,400 horsepower that ran the 2 propellers and recharged the batteries for a surface speed of 23 knots. While submerged, they used their batteries to power 2 motors which produced 2,000 horsepower for a top speed of 8 knots. Range on the surface was 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, and submerged they could do 60 nautical miles at 3 knots. Test diving depth was 100 meters. A single midget sub could be carried after the sail. I-16 was a mere 7 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor on December 7th. She had to be that close because in the pre-dawn hours she launched her mini or midget submarine to try to sneak into the harbor so as to coordinate with the dawn air raid. It didn't go well for the midget, and when it failed to return by the middle of the month, she returned to Japan, arriving at the start of January 1942, and began training a new class of midget subcrews and trying to come up with better tactics. In mid-April, she left Japan and headed west, only briefly pausing to try to catch the Doolittle force, arriving at Penang late in the month. At the end of April, she left Penang and sailed west into the Indian Ocean. On the evening of May 29th, only 10 miles east of Diego Suarez, she launched her midget sub to attack the port, but it was never heard from again. So she patrolled the Indian Ocean until returning to Japan in late August. With her refit completed in mid-October, she was sent south with the mission of running midget subs to Guadalcanal. This had very little success, and in mid-January 1943, she switched to supply running to Guadalcanal, evacuating troops on the return trip and New Guinea. This was brought to an abrupt end on April 2nd when she collided with I-20, also returning from Leh, sending her back to Japan for repairs. With repairs completed in mid-October, she again headed south and made several supply runs from Rabaul to New Guinea until the end of the year when she returned to Japan for refit. With upkeep completed in mid-March 1944, she was again sent south to run supplies from Truk to Bougainville. Having been detected by aircraft on the afternoon of May 19, 1944, northeast of Cape Alexander, she was sunk by the destroyer Escort England, with Raby and George along to watch, basically. I-18 started the war off the coast of Pearl by launching her midget sub to try to get into the harbor. Instead, it was found and sunk in Keehee Lagoon. Later, it was recovered by the Americans, who wondered what lunatic would man this thing. With her midget sub clearly not coming back, she patrolled Hawaiian waters until late February 1942, when she returned to Japan for refit. In mid-April, she left Japan and headed west, only briefly pausing to try to catch the Doolittle force, and arrived at Penang late in the month. At the end of April, she left Penang and sailed west into the Indian Ocean. On the evening of May 29th, only 10 miles east of Diego Suarez, she tried to launch her midget sub to attack the port, but its engine broke down, so it was jettisoned, and she patrolled the Indian Ocean until returning to Japan in late August. With her refit completed in mid-December, she was sent south and began making supply runs to Guadalcanal until the start of February 1943, when covering the evacuation of the island became the new order of the day. South of San Cristobal Island on February 11, 1943, she was spotted by a float plane from the Helena, which vectored the destroyer Fletcher in, which sunk her that afternoon. I-20 started the war off the coast of Pearl Harbor by launching her mini-sub to get into the harbor. It was her midget sub the Ward spotted and sank that morning. With her midget sub missing the rendezvous in mid-December, she left Hawaiian waters and went to patrol the Fiji-Samoa area until mid-January 1942, when she returned to Japan. In mid-April, she left Japan and headed west, only briefly pausing to try to catch the Doolittle force, and arrived at Penang late in the month. At the end of April, she left Penang and sailed west into the Indian Ocean. On the evening of May 29th, off Diego Suarez, she launched her midget sub to attack the port. Her midget sub actually worked, and with its 2 torpedoes managed to heavily damage the battleship Ramillies and sink the British tanker British Loyalty. What they didn't manage to do was make it back. Instead, after being depth charged, they had to beach their craft, and eventually the 2 men were killed in a shootout with the Royal Marines that occupied the island. When her mini-sub failed to return, I-20 patrolled the Indian Ocean until returning to Japan in late August. With her overhaul completed in late October, she sailed south and ran midget subs to Guadalcanal until mid-December. From mid-December to mid-May 1943, she made several supply runs to first Guadalcanal and then New Guinea, until returning to Japan in late May for upkeep. With her refit completed in early August, she again headed south to patrol the New Hebrides area, including Espiritu Santo. On the evening of September 3, 1943, off Espiritu Santo, she was sunk by the destroyer Ellet. I-22 launched her midget sub off Pearl Harbor in the pre-dawn hours of December 7, 1941. Just after dawn, it was sighted by the destroyer Monaghan, the DMS Zane, the mine layer Breeze, the repair ship Medusa, and the seaplane tenders Tangier and Curtis. Looking for some payback, Monaghan rammed her and then depth charged the mini sub northwest of Ford Island. With her midget sub clearly missing the rendezvous, I-22 patrolled the Hawaii area, even shelling Johnston Island on December 15th, until returning to Japan for refit in late January 1942. With her refit completed in mid-April, she headed south and patrolled the Coral Sea in support of the upcoming invasion of Port Moresby and the ensuing Battle of the Coral Sea until mid-May, when she returned to Truk. Again carrying a midget sub, she soon left Truk and headed for Sydney, where on the evening of May 31st, she launched her midget sub to attack the harbor. It was a mess, and not only was the midget sunk, but it was later recovered with the dead crew on board and is now on display in Canberra's Anzac Hall. Having again lost her midget sub, I-22 began patrolling off Australia's east coast until returning to Japan for refit in mid-July. With her refit completed in mid-September, she sailed south to patrol the Solomons in support of the ongoing Guadalcanal campaign. On October 6, 1944, she was spotted by a Catalina, which sunk her. I-24 was off Pearl Harbor in the pre-dawn hours of December 7, 1941, and launched her midget sub to attack the harbor. Instead, it ran aground, was spotted by the destroyer Helm and fired at, got loose, was depth charged, ran aground again, and was abandoned by its two-man crew with its self-destruct charge failing to go off, the lone survivor being the first Japanese taken prisoner during the war. Later, the midget sub itself was recovered and is now on display at the Nimitz Pacific Museum in Texas. With her midget sub MIA, I-24 patrolled Hawaiian waters, even shelling Midway on the evening of January 25, 1942, until returning to Japan at the start of February. With her refit completed in mid-April, she headed south and patrolled the Coral Sea in support of the upcoming invasion of Port Moresby and the ensuing Battle of the Coral Sea until mid-May, when she returned to Truk. Again carrying a midget sub, she soon left Truk and headed south for Sydney. Unfortunately, while servicing the mini-sub en route, on May 19th, it exploded on the deck and had to be jettisoned, causing the sub to have to U-turn back to Truk to get a replacement. Having got a replacement, and now off Sydney, on the evening of May 21st, she launched her midget sub to attack the harbor. Its torpedo missed the cruiser Chicago, but did manage to blow up the accommodation ship Kudabul, which in turn damaged the Dutch submarine K9. The midget in turn was never seen again. With its mini-sub gone, the sub churned to raiding along Australia's east coast, even managing to shell a lighthouse, even though it was aiming for a bridge, until mid-June, when it returned to Japan for refit. With her refit completed at the end of August, she again headed south to patrol around Guadalcanal until mid-November, when she returned to Truk. Again carrying a midget sub, soon thereafter she sailed south and launched her mini-sub against U.S. shipping around Guadalcanal to little effect, until mid-January 1943. With Guadalcanal essentially being given up on from late January until late February, she ran supplies to New Guinea and then returned to Japan for refit in early March. With her refit completed in mid-May, she headed north to support the evacuation of the Aleutians. Northeast of Shimia Island, on foggy June 11, 1943, she was found by the 675-ton subchaser PC-487, which rammed and sunk her.